So our last panel this afternoon, we saved the best for last, for those of you hardy souls who made it all the way through. We're going to talk about strengthening cooperation and enhancing U.S. engagement in Central Asia. And we have a star-studded panel today. We will lead off with former Ambassador Allan Mustard, served as ambassador to Turkmenistan 2015 to 2019. He had a long career with the Department of State, but many don't know that he was also an agriculture officer of note, and an award-winning cartographer, I should note as well. His accomplishments are legendary in the diplomatic community. In his own mind, I don't know what's going on in there. We also have Zuhra Halimova, who brings a wealth of professional experience in the development world with Open Society Foundation, USAID, many different programs, and she's even a visiting scholar for this institution. So I don't know what more you could do than that. Then we have Dr. Aida Aidarkulova, who, again, with Soros Foundation, is an expert in public policy and rule of law issues. Again, for this particular panel, really a voice that we need to hear from. And last but not least, Dr. Sebastien Peyrouse, a distinguished research professor here, the chair of this particular program, author of many scholarly works, and a voice of passion for this region. So if I can start off, we will turn to Ambassador Mustard.
I'm going to go use
anxiously because he's not tall enough. He has to use the lectern.
Can we lower this thing? All right, thank you. Are you controlling them or am I controlling the slides? Here, just
likes to
up
be
and
in
down. Okay, very simple. Okay. Thank you very much for that, Eric, and thank you all for staying to the very last panel. When Sebastien asked me to do this presentation, it occurred to me that I have photographs of virtually everything he wanted me to talk about. And so rather than put up a bunch of slides that have lots of dry text and numbers on them, I really only have a couple of slides with dry text and numbers on them. We'll get to them. But I want to start with photographs. The very first thing, if you want to talk about engaging Central Asia in other spheres, most important thing is just to show up. Okay, so just show up. In 2015, we had two catastrophes that occurred at the embassy in Ashgabat. One was that we had an inspector general team that showed up to do an inspection. The other was that John Kerry arrived. He was Secretary of State. He was the second Secretary of State of the United States to visit Central Asia. The first one was James Baker in 1992. So do the math. There was a bit of a gap between the time that Jim Baker came and the time that John Kerry came. And in between, no Secretary of State visited Central Asia. How many times has Vladimir Putin been to Central Asia? Anybody know? I don't know. I can't count that high. We know that other leaders around the world have been to Central Asia, particularly Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, who seem to get most of the love. But when you show up, you are treated like visiting royalty. The Central Asians get very excited. So my advice is just show up. Okay, this is yours truly when he had more hair, autographing books in the Turkmen language at the American Corner in Mari. We and the embassy were translating books from English into the Turkmen language. We did books like To Kill a Mockingbird, Farm Boy from the Laura Gendels Wilder series, A Little House on the Prairie, Harold and His Purple Crayon, I've forgotten how many others, Charlotte's Web. Translate them into Turkmen, and they went like hotcakes. We would print them up in Baku, have them shipped across the Caspian, and go give them away. My wife and I used to drive out into the countryside as part of my cartographic habit. And while mapping villages, we would give away books. And we would literally have little kids running after my RAV4 because they'd heard that there were these crazy people giving away books in the Turkmen language. Absolutely extraordinary. This is a way of extending American culture. So I hope we're still doing that. We have 3 American corners in Turkmenistan. I don't know how many American corners we have in other countries of Central Asia, but these are centers where people can come to learn about America. You can come there, you can learn English, study English, and seeing these kids coming in who've been coming for 3 or 4 years, absorbing the language like a sponge, and able to speak colloquial, slang-ridden American English, never having been to the United States, is absolutely astounding. The Ministry of National Security of Turkmenistan tried to shut down the American corner in Dashaguz. I protested vehemently enough that they allowed it to reopen, and this was the ceremony of reopening of that American corner in Dashaguz. We have 3D printers in them where kids can come and can make things. We call it a maker space. In addition to seeing movies, checking out books and things like that. This young lady will receive her master's degree at Indiana University this May. She was the outstanding student of political science at Montana State University at Billings 2 years ago. I attended her graduation. I'm not going to make this graduation this year because I have a conflict, but she's an absolutely extraordinary individual and is typical of the Central Asian students who come to the United States to study. Education is something that we do and should do more of. And here is where we get to the part where I have to admit I'm a practicing economist, and practicing economists live and die on statistics. So I have to show you some statistics here about education. This is the number of Central Asian students studying in Russia as of about a year ago, 182,176. This is the number of Central Asian students studying in the United States as of about a year ago, 4,703. Who is winning the hearts and minds of Central Asians of the next generation that will come to power in Central Asia? We're not even in the game. Now, if you go back in history to the 1950s and 60s, we brought thousands of people from around the world to the United States to study in universities. It was paid for by the Technical Cooperation Administration, which at the time was part of the Department of State, and then in 1961 was transformed into the U.S. Agency for International Development. When my wife and I were in New Delhi, we founded the New Delhi National Capital Region chapter of the University of Illinois Alumni Association. We found that there were approximately 300 alumni in the New Delhi capital area, of whom we managed to track down about 90, some of them who had studied in the United States in the 1950s. They were still alive. These were the most pro-American people in India I ever met. They were the people who understood America, who appreciated America, and were horrified by the anti-American sentiment that permeates Indian society. We're not even in the game. A few years ago, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York put on a temporary exposition called Court and Cosmos, the Great Age of the Seljuks, and for the first time in history managed to talk the Turkmen government into loaning 12 artifacts from Turkmen museums to put on display. This was absolutely extraordinary. These sorts of cultural exchanges lead to some absolutely otherwise unattainable results. In Turkmenistan, at the embassy, there are only 2 ministries we can talk to without first sending a diplomatic note to the foreign ministry and receiving permission from the foreign ministry to talk to that ministry. They are the Ministry of Defense, which for fairly obvious reasons, our defense attaché is allowed to talk to them without sending a diplomatic note first to the foreign ministry. The other is the Ministry of Culture. And it's because of these interactions that led to this. And here's an example of the interactions we have with the Ministry of Culture and on the cultural sphere. This is the interior side of the entryway of the Daya Hatin Caravanserai, which is the best preserved caravanserai in the Silk Road. It's in Labat province, about a 2-hour drive outside of Turkmenabad. The site on the right has already been restored, as you can see. The funding for that was provided by the Ambassador's Fund for Cultural Preservation, which is an initiative of the Department of State to do cultural preservation around the world. The site on the left, as you can see, is still awaiting restoration, although I think that's already been done since I took this photograph. This is why we had access to some level of officialdom in Turkmenistan. And on my visits to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I could walk in, I could talk to the foreign minister, and one of the first topics that would come up was what we were doing most recently in terms of cultural preservation. We had this project, we had other projects around the country, preserving their culture. Sports. 2017, we had the Asian Indoor and Martial Arts Games, and believe it or not, a part of America is part of that branch of the Olympics. American Samoa and Guam both participated in the Asian Indoor and Martial Arts Games. And the Guamanians didn't want to talk to us in the embassy for some reason. I never quite figured that out. But the Samoans were delighted to accept an invitation to come to a reception at my residence, where some of the Samoan athletes met some of my local staff who had earned medals in sports activities in Turkmenistan. So sports are out there. We can engage in sports. We can, and we're not doing very much. This was a singular event, but it's something that we could do much more of because everybody loves soccer. Everybody loves sports. Everybody loves half-court basketball. So we could do ever so much more on this. Mariachi band in Ashgabat, Turkmenistan. It brought the house down. This is the mariachi band Champagne Nevin from San Diego. Our public affairs section programmed them, brought them in, and this is during the encore. The crowd was on its feet, clapping and stamping their feet, yelling, "Bis, bis, bis." Of course, you all know what that means. So they came out, and I was backstage to congratulate them when they decided to come out and do the encore. So you can see they're backed up by Turkmen musicians here, and they're out here playing, and you can see the standing room only crowd there. People were sitting on the stairways and were standing down in the pit in front of the stage. The place was absolutely packed. So we can go in with these sorts of cultural events, movies, orchestras, bands, and we will pack the house in and extend soft power. In the last photograph, this is Major Pavel Tendetnik, who was the chief of my Office of Military Cooperation in Ashgabat. I put that up simply because there's not much else you have a photograph of military installations without getting in trouble. But Pavel was very successful in establishing military cooperation with a notoriously xenophobic and hermetic government, mostly in the field of emergency medicine, because the Turkmen were taking casualties down on the Afghan border. So when we came in and said, we can help you with that, we have advanced medical kits that we can donate to you. And we can also bring in people to give you training on military medicine, which they readily accepted. So there are always opportunities. even in the military to military sphere with a country that espouses positive neutrality. So here are the lessons. Just show up, publish books in local languages, teach the English language, bring people here for US education, do museum exchanges, do cultural preservation, play sports, play music, and don't forget military to military cooperation. Thank you very much.
So much, Allan. And now we will turn to Zuhra.
Yes, hi, thank you. It's a midnight in Dushanbe, so I will try to be really clear on what I'm saying before I fall asleep, probably. But the title of my presentation or talk, it's Empowering US Engagement in Tajikistan, which be, I think, listening to our previous speaker, it actually means that there is lots of overlap in what I will be saying, but I will try to be a little bit more Tajikistan focused. Sebastien proposed this subject to talk about, and we had a very good chance to talk before I came from US back to Tajikistan about many issues which are evolving. And I think we have to start with this whole understanding of what is this new era and all dilemmas about. We are coming now to very, very new phenomenon that is actually creating more complications in the collaborations and seeing ourselves, the polarization globally, the global whole idea. It's kind of showing the time of ambiguity, global crossroad. Where are we going? What are we building after all these years building democracies? There was a very famous 2013 EBRD report, Stuck in Transition. And that report was basically referring to Central Asian countries which are constantly doing reforms and they're constantly transiting, but it's less and less clear where we are transiting to. And now it's even more after all these years, after basically a decade, the global impact and the situation is actually changing the behavior in Central Asia, although there are many different initiatives happening, but still the continuum kind of changing. And we see that because the all context, the contextual uncertainty due to at least the last events, so like Afghanistan and Taliban coming back to power, which actually impacted a lot on Central Asian decision making and how to see what it is the future going to be like, having Taliban right across the river. War in Ukraine, of course, the last situation in Middle East is not helping. It's actually putting more pressure toward the countries in Central Asia because it does not give you more opportunity to be more optimistic. And also, of course, the last terrorist activities which were happening in Istanbul, of course, previously in Iran, and of course, last one in Russia, in Moscow, with actually involving the Central Asian or Tajik citizens in it. It actually gives a lot of other pressure, layers of the pressure on the decision making, what the future to be like. The issue is that there are expectations of all these countries in relation to what is the engagement to be with the donor which is investing heavily in the development of this country. In this case, United States. What is the expectations of United States from the country like Tajikistan, which stays bordering with China and Afghanistan, and it's actually quite not as developed as their neighbors and has a lot of constraints. And understanding these constraints actually will be helpful and is helpful to define what is the engagement level would be coming from the donor country. But it's also important to understand what is the expectation of Tajikistan from United States, what it is Tajikistan wants to get from United States, and how they see United States, as well as how United States looks and views basically Tajikistan currently under the circumstances. We also have to look at this growing polarization globally, the polarization which is creating more and more discussions and dilemmas between the global South and global North, where we are actually fitting. Are we actually global South or we are actually global North? And since we are not CASA anymore, because Afghanistan is somehow detached us from South Asia because of Taliban coming, how we see ourselves, in what capacity are we being viewed? Of course, we have to understand that nothing stays in the place. Things are evolutionized. If you look at the whole series of the documents adopted by USAID as development agency, as well as the US government and military cooperation and security cooperation, you'll actually see the evolution on how things were evolutionizing and what the basically verbalization and description of the investment of United States to Tajikistan was made for. And you basically seeing more and more, especially after September 11, that security concern is actually becoming a cornerstone and how the Tajikistan is viewed as ally on counterterrorism and counter-narcotics. And less by now, we see the commitment for human rights and democratization, especially now when the values are being somehow diminishing when you come and talk about human rights and democratization. And democratization is also losing its notion. It's not the same as it was in 90s and beginning of 2000. So it comes to a point to really decide what actually worked with all the investment happening to Tajikistan, what didn't and why. These are crucial questions, and we have to be really honest with ourselves that are we actually becoming more and more critical about our own participation in all this engagement or not. But did we actually meet those expectations we described in our strategies as before, as regional strategies, country, documents, and etc.? Do we see the investment which was made from taxpayers' money of US was actually working as it was described before? So we have to really also see that the evolution of how US is promoting, different institutions like democracy and food security and economic growth is basically somehow was tied mainly to Afghanistan agenda in the beginning. And after Taliban coming back to power, that, connection was actually switched to have a country perspective. Is it good or is it bad? This is like time will show. However, the country specific would give more opportunity for country to focus to itself rather than to be one part of this big region. However, we have to really see the evolution of C5+1 initiative and recently this big forum of B5+1, which was actually giving us a very different flavor of collaboration, where the civil society, particularly, I want to mention that, was represented specifically with only professional associations, not the human rights organizations, no media organizations, and etc. This is a very, very interesting shift on actually considering that professional associations are becoming more and more important in that relation rather than the old school human rights activism and etc. So that would be something we have to be really cautious about, since professional associations, with all respect, are closely working for the benefit of the members of associations only. And it would be very tricky to assume that these professional associations would actually fulfill the role for entire civil society or society by itself, well, and commit to the values of human rights and transparency. I also want to mention that Tajikistan has been very active, actively working, and US have been actively working in Tajikistan in several subjects. Military to military, which was mentioned by previous speaker, but I think we also have to mention that the institutional building and strong capacity building on the counter narcotics, drug trafficking, and anti-terrorism have been a very, very vivid example. You will actually see lots of reports about it in our media as well. And the country and the government of Tajikistan basically, gives this opportunity and actually gives the very, very, vivid news or media outreach to this particular collaboration. Does it mean that it's much more bigger as an importance for Tajikistan? I can't really say. Because U.S. government and USAID in particularly invest a lot in different other subjects, especially like education and health, civil society development, democratization, and many other subjects. However, the military aspect, military to military, or counter narcotics, or many other of these type of subjects are covered by government media much more. So probably that is the part of the mutual interest and common ground of understanding which is built, and I think that is something to really think about. Tajikistan and US have been quite effectively working in many subjects over the years. They have been, of course, following the, this whole goal statement of Foundations for Sustainable Development in Tajikistan. And also, we have to really say that one of the important, terminology which was used, it was about human capital. A human capital was a cornerstone in the last documents, which is very important. Of course, any development agency would actually stress on this. However, the human capital cannot be realized unless there is enough, the environment for realization is positive or good enough. For this, you have to have a good governance and accountability in place. The human capital could be grown over the years. It takes a long time to really grow enough human capital. But then the question is, what is the critical mass of human capital to be grown that would be enough to actually fulfill the obligations and aims which were produced by all these documents and the expectations? So we should not really create this dimension alone, because it's a cross-cutting issue throughout all the subjects. And that's why I think the expectation of US government and engagement on the issues of human capital but it's also fulfillment of obligations and expectations of the Tajikistan government should be considered. How we'll do it together. Of course, the issue is how to deal with the poverty, how to, bring back people from migration, and that would be investing in Tajikistan. They would actually come and be active citizens, and it will create some sort of resiliency and sustainability of the country rather than exporting the labor to other countries to develop that countries there. So of course remittance is important, but it's not enough. And the last thing I want to say is about moving forward.
Zuhra, can we maybe save that for the discussion, because we need to get to our next speaker? We're
Of course, yes.
15 minutes.
Okay.
So much. And if I can now shift to Aida, which I think it's even later where you are at this point. So we greatly appreciate your staying up as well.
Thank you so much. It is actually the same time zone now. We're sharing with other neighboring countries in Central Asia, including with the Dushanbe. So it is hello from tomorrow. It's March 29th in Almaty. My intervention would be about the funding for human rights work in Kazakhstan, and I just wanted to start with the overall topic of today's convening about building resilience in Central Asia, which is not, actually building resilience in Central Asia or elsewhere is not possible without strong and vocal civil society. And human rights organizations and individual human rights activists are in the heart of this work. Let me just highlight a few important challenges that human rights defenders are facing with when it comes to the financing of the important activities. First, I have to start that Kazakhstan is upper middle income country and most donors have left the country. As a result, the government of Kazakhstan became the largest grant maker. And as it usually happens, the government is not keen to fund the most sensitive human rights topics, covering mainly service providers in the social and economic rights sectors. Majority of those recipients cannot openly criticize the government as they are heavily dependent on it. Second, budgets of remained small donors community were being reduced dramatically in recent years. Lack of understanding of the importance of the human rights work in Central Asia in general, but also lack of understanding of the role of Central Asia region at the global level and its significance to the global democratic decline is just unimaginable. I have looked through a number of donor organizations that are still active in Kazakhstan and their budgets and found it disproportional to the needs and opportunities in the country. Just to give you some context, there are two biggest funders in the human rights work in Kazakhstan. One is the USAID and the other is the EU delegation to Kazakhstan. Remaining funders are primarily embassies with their small grants program and a few private and public foundations. Again, just to give you some context, the average grant coming from those small grants program is about 30 to 50,000 US dollars. As you probably know, Open Society Foundations have transformed its strategic approach to the regions and priorities, and we feel its negative impact to the entire field already. So remain civil society funders in Kazakhstan, including the biggest ones, increasingly incorporating to their call for proposals an obligation to implement their projects in close cooperation with the governmental agencies or organizations. This is not always possible for the human rights organizations, as it entails the conflict of interest and might question the independence and public trust. Again, just to give you some concrete examples, I looked through the figures of existing and anticipated US assistance to Europe, Eurasia, and Central Asia, just to compare some figures. For example, for Kazakhstan, the requested amount is about 5 million US dollars, while the same assistance for Uzbekistan is over 30 million US dollars. For Georgia, for example, it's over 80 million US dollars. And for Azerbaijan, it is about 9 million US dollars. So imagine the size of the countries, for example, Georgia, and compare with Kazakhstan, or we can look at the country profiles and statuses. For example, Azerbaijan is also the upper middle income country. But the funding that is requested for Azerbaijan and existing for Azerbaijan is almost 2 times bigger than to Kazakhstan. And just to keep in mind that recently the USAID activities were claimed to be not welcomed in Azerbaijan. And despite this fact, the requested amount is 2 times bigger than in Kazakhstan. So I don't think that this reflects the statement about the strategic importance of Kazakhstan to the United States. And frankly speaking, we don't know how much out of those $5 million will actually be streamed to support the human rights work. I also think that the local NGOs are perfectly capable to implement projects by themselves and bring their knowledge and expertise. This is being said to urge the donors community to work directly with local organizations, avoiding international intermediary organizations that are playing the major applicants, getting the huge piece of a small pie, but not necessarily having clear understanding of the local context. In addition to the allocation of the sufficient amount of funds for the human rights work, the funders should secure non-restricted funds to make sure the sustainability and development of the human rights field. Traditional project-based grants can only be used for specific areas of work or types of expenses. Project grants are also often exclude spending on core costs such as salaries or infrastructure. But these expenses are necessary part of running a human rights organization. This way, if the funders would secure the non-restricted funding, they would just, instead of just paying for certain projects, donors can support an organization's entire mission and theory of change. Just wanted to say that human rights organizations are traditionally mission-driven organizations and cannot easily adapt to the challenges connected with the unnecessary dependencies that certain types of funding mechanisms might bring. Deprioritization and compromising of the human rights work will have a negative impact in mid and short term, because this is a basis and prerequisite for a strong and vibrant civil society. I just shortly wanted to reflect to what Zuhra told in her presentation about the human rights organizations' presence at different business panels like B5+1. None of the human rights organizations from Kazakhstan were presented at this B5+1 meeting. But I have to say that in order to meaningfully engage the stakeholders from the civil society, it is just crucial to invite independent civil society organizations and human rights organizations, because neither the professional associations nor the governmentally funded NGOs can substitute voice of independent civil society. And just lastly, wanted just also briefly reflect to what Kate Waters told in her presentation during the previous panel about other types of restrictions, such as the foreign agents law. This is also a huge a challenge for the human rights community, not only in Kazakhstan, but in entire Central Asia, because as you probably know, from the last year, from the fall of the last year, the list of foreign funded organizations and individuals are publicly available in public domain, and especially the personal data of individual recipients of the foreign funding is publicly available, which actually threatens them. And unfortunately, I haven't seen any projects that were particularly tackled this particular issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Excellent presentation. Following an excellent presentation, So now the floor is turned to Dr. Peyrouse.
Thank you very much, Eric. So I mean, it's not an easy task to be the last speaker. So first, I'm going to try to keep you awake, and second, because I'm going to try not to overlap too much with what was said before me. Also, in a way, it might be interesting in a way to echo what was said, which is what I'm going to do to some extent. So, and I'm going to start by echoing what Kate was saying. I mean, the previous panel is that we see in all Central Asia, two different levels, of course, but we see in all countries an ongoing authoritarianism, or I should say for some of these countries, an increasing political authoritarianism, and which includes restrictions on civil society organizations by controlling their activities through registration, increasing restricting laws, etc., or by co-opting civil society organizations, by restricting the opportunities for them to get funds, and especially foreign funds, and also in several cases by repressing their activists. And this authoritarianism comes with many challenges, which include the growing questioning of the concept of a free civil society. I mean, local governments, Russia and China, and I would say increasingly since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, with a huge disinformation campaign, has tried to circulate the idea that a free civil society, which is not new, but even more now, that a free civil society is a Western and, how to say, outdated concept, or that NGOs are foreign agents or are the instruments for the West to destabilize the countries and to provoke color revolution. So in this difficult context, what I would like to do today is to echo the voices and concerns of local civil society organizations and their activists who actually wish to contradict this narrative against civil society, who are increasingly worried about their capacity to engage in this authoritarian context. And not only in democratizing their country, but also in the development sector due to the lack of a free civil society. And I would also like to report their concern about the decreasing engagement of Western stakeholders in the development of a free civil society. And by the way, what I mean here by civil society is a free civil society is a civil society which is not only capable of independent expression activities, but also is able to operate beyond the constraints and directives of the government. And what I'm going to say today is actually based on two distinct research projects on civil society in the US and foreign engagement in the regions that have been conducting this last 2 years, and on which I'm still working. So for these two different projects, I've conducted so far about 85 interviews in all Central Asian countries, well, including Turkmenistan, much less so far in Tajikistan, which is going to be my next step. So I'm actually combining the interviews from these two research projects to report some of the findings regarding how civil society organizations, activists in Central Asia view the US engagement, and in many cases, actually more broadly, how they view Western engagement. So basically, the huge majority of my interviewees acknowledge that foreign funders are engaged in many sectors in Central Asia. Well, all Central Asian governments claim to have invested in the development of the social system, for example. The reality, as you know, on the ground, especially when you go outside the capital and big cities, is significantly different. I mean, there are sharp economic and social disparities everywhere in Central Asia, which provoke, which feed public dissatisfaction. And in this context, there are so many sectors that need to be addressed, and that's the US commitment, actually the US commitment was really welcomed by my interviewees, for example, in education, in healthcare, in the prevention of violent extremism, on non-discrimination, etc. And some CSOs actually even encourage the US to do more to address some specific sectors concerning, for example, interethnic relations or gender equality. Now, on the other hand, and here here comes an essential point that I would like to insist on today, is that all the CSOs I interviewed consider that foreign funders, including the US or in Europe, despite their statements, are very little involved in the development of a free civil society or in other sectors related to human rights. The main concern, actually, of a majority of CSOs I interviewed is that Western donors have engaged in a kind of self-censorship over this past 15 or 20 years, which has limited their focus on democratization, on authoritarianism, on political repression. Instead, they are focused on sectors which are less sensitive for Central Asian governments, such as those, for example, related to economic development. And they consider, I mean, my interviewees, a huge majority of my interviewees consider that this approach does not challenge, or at least not enough, Central Asian governments' desire to focus on implementing apolitical social aid projects, that this does not challenge the fact that the government regulates a few active independent CSOs to the fringes of political and civil society activism and prevents them from actively participating in the formulation of state policies. So what should be done? And well, of course, I mean, there's no magical recipe, but here again, I'm going to echo what the local CSOs I interviewed reported, and their expectation, actually, they reported to me. And the first point is that also an increase in foreign fundings, of course, would be welcome. But most of the CSOs activists I interviewed said the question was not actually necessarily the total amount of funds which are invested or that foreign funders are engaging in Central Asia, but rather first, their policy to work only with a very limited number of local partners. And second, the imbalance in how they share their support among the CSOs with which they cooperate. And well, I have limited time, then of course, I don't want to overgeneralize, but basically over the past 10 years, funders, for example, from or USAID or for the European Union have significantly reduced the number of local CSOs they partner with. They have instead actually preferred to engage in larger projects that involved a limited number of foreign and local partners that they trust, and whose grants actually are easier to administer than would be, for example, multiple smaller projects, which would also require more staff. Interviewees also consider that some grantees have or partners are often selected because they will not cause friction with local authorities. Another issue which is raised by CSO is that foreign funders, funds which are allocated for the development of civil society are very often significantly reduced by the large overheads which are taken by some international NGOs with which foreign funders partner in Central Asia. And actually, several CSOs activists reported to me, I mean, they contrast the significant funding provided by Western funders to some big local or international sub-grantees, and on the other hand, a very low amount which actually ends up in the hands of local NGOs. So all these elements means that, and I could hear one of my interviewees who said that Western funders are actually feeding big fishes while small fishes die. So what do they suggest? Well, for them, I mean, this means splitting more the fundings and involve more local partners. Many interviewees insisted on the fact that they consider smaller CSOs to be better informed on the context and local difficulties, which I think is not totally wrong. One recommendation coming up regularly is that foreign funders need to talk, or at least to talk more, even with CSOs that they are not funding. I mean, the context of authoritarianism, many of local CSOs do not feel heard and have the feeling that foreign engagement is elaborated more from abroad and is too much disconnected from local expectation. And they view foreign stakeholders as a rare opportunity to have their voice heard. And I'm not saying that, I mean, foreign funders don't do that at all, but that was really a criticism that came up very, very regularly in, I mean, actually in most of my, in my interviews. Another point which came up many times is that foreign funders' lack of investment foreign funders' lack of engagement with Kazakh-speaking, Uzbek-speaking, Kyrgyz-speaking, Tajik-speaking organizations and populations. The idea is that for CSOs, foreign funders are missing an opportunity by not working enough with people who do not speak Russian or who do not work in Russian, which is a case a lot, for example, outside the big cities. And which brings me to my next point, which is that they recommend foreign funders to be much more engaged in the regions, beyond the big cities, beyond the capital cities. I mean, civil citizens, my interview is actually pointed to the concentration of foreign funders in only a few large cities. And several interviewees said that Western funders, I mean, some of them are actually engaged outside the cities, but that this engagement is mostly focused on social economic issues and so does not really contribute to the development of small independent CSOs which are engaged in promoting a free civil society, while foreign support would be very important in provinces where access to funding in general and to foreign funding in particular is even more difficult. So, another last point is that they really recommend to avoid working with a mouthpiece of the government. And I'm aware, of course, that's not easy. I mean, all CSOs I interviewed agreed that an overwhelming majority of civil society organizations in Central Asia, with different level, I mean, from one country to another, but most of the CSOs are either created or funded by the state and therefore are gun goes. I mean, well, but the point is that despite the suspicions that gun goes links with political authorities may arise, I mean, their activities are not necessarily irrelevant or inefficient, but the message of my interview is that foreign funders need to balance cooperation with goes with more independent organization, which takes me back to my previous point, which is a need to diversify local partners. So I'm going to conclude with just a few remarks. So the first one is that, I mean, please don't get me wrong. I mean, my point here is not to bash the foreign funders. I mean, I do not want to say, I'm not saying that the United States or the European Union is not doing anything. That would be totally unfair. And all have, for example, USAID has limited fundings, limited number of staff, and it is difficult to work in authoritarian contexts, especially when you have a physical presence there. You take the risk of being kicked out. And you have also, it's even more difficult now to work in Central Asia if you take into account the huge disinformation campaign, which is circulated by Russia, but also by Central Asian governments, by some of them. And also an important point is that, so my interviewees criticize a lot that foreign funders are mostly engaged in development, but on the other hand, we need to also take into account that being engaged in development is also a way to interact with local CSOs and with local population, and in a way, you know, to influence, to bring the ideas of democracy, of free civil society, and so on. And I had a very limited time, and we need to take into account, of course, that all Central Asian countries are different, are increasingly different. But overall, what I would like to say is that, I mean, the feeling I got from all my from a huge majority of my interviews is that many of the activists feel abandoned, they feel alone. They perceive a kind of a feeling of fatigue among civil society activists now who are forced into a kind of unequal struggle against state authoritarianism everywhere in Central Asia. And this also fuels their concerns that young people's civic education and participation has been declining year after year, and that activists, experts, and academics are increasingly afraid to discuss subjects related to human rights. But also talking about a free civil society, an important point here is not talking only about democracy. I mean, the lack of a free civil society will continue to hinder the improvement of a number of social and economic issues to which the governments of Central Asia claims to be committed. Just to give you a quick example, I'm going to echo what Kate was saying. Well, Central Asian governments have claimed to be committed, for example, to the fight against climate change, environmental issues, and Kate reported that how CSO's activists have been able, in a way, I mean, in Kazakhstan, to engage, to support the fight against climate change, but still, overall, the capacity of Central Asian states to tackle environmental issues has been hampered by a lack of independent research and engagement, which remain controlled, strictly controlled by political authorities and monopolized by state institutions, but also by a lack of autonomy of civil society organizations, which are under pressure to avoid sensitive topics, which means that CSOs working on environmental issues often take a very descriptive approach and provide few concrete recommendations for government action. So at the end of the day, what we see is that Central Asian politicians use very often ecological narratives for public relation purposes. So again, while it's important not to confuse it's important to make important distinctions between different countries in the region, I would say that Central Asia is in a way, at a momentum. I mean, the atmosphere of resentment of the population due to social issues, to corruption, authoritarianism, combined with the war in Ukraine, its economic and geopolitical impact means that it's probably the right time for foreign stakeholders to be engaged, to be more engaged, including in promoting a free civil society and human rights. And generally speaking, all the values that Central Asian states, by being participating states of the OSCE, are supposed to implement. And I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Well, the finalists did not disappoint. So, lots to unpack there. I guess I'll turn it to the audience first. Questions from any of you you'd like to see expanded a little bit or probed, please. There's a microphone feeding its way to you.
Yes, I just wanted to add a little bit to what Ambassador Mustard was saying about American Corners. My name is Mitchell Pullman, and another hat I wear is I oftentimes read flex applications for those familiar high school exchange student program run by American consuls funded by the State Department, of which Turkmenistan is actually all the Central Asian countries participate. And I cannot stress enough how many applications I read from kids from Turkmenistan just raving about the American Corners, talking about how it changed their lives. But it's not just English and books and movies. They also they talked about the public speaking classes they took, classes on leadership skills, volunteer opportunities. Sadly, schools in Turkmenistan usually lack these sort of things, and they're getting it through American Corners at very little cost to us. And I'll just add one other anecdote. I can't remember which country it was, but I think it actually was Turkmenistan, where several students wrote about participating in a volunteer activity, a park cleanup, I believe it was, or something. And the American ambassador came and participated, and they were amazed, and they were even more amazed that he stopped and spoke with them. One student even said he felt inspired now to become an ambassador himself. So, those little things really do make a big impression. I mean, I've had my share of experiences with Russian diplomats. I can't imagine any of them, lowering themselves to participate in a park cleanup or anything like that. And this really is sort of our hidden, soft power, and we should be investing as much in it as we possibly can. I also now know why several kids said that To Kill Their Mockingbird is their favorite book. I was a little mystified by that, but
Must have been Matt Klimo who did the park cleanup, because I haven't done a park cleanup since I was in high school. Yeah.
No, if I may say just a quick word on the specific case of Turkmenistan. So I was saying that I conducted interviews in 4 actually of the 5 countries, including Turkmenistan. And what was striking for me, when I was conducting my interviews or when I facilitated these interviews in Turkmenistan, is that the West and the United States had a much better image in Turkmenistan than in other countries. So my explanation, and I don't know, Allan, if you will agree on that, I was wondering because you have so much disinformation in Kazakhstan, in Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan that you don't have in Turkmenistan, because the information is so much controlled. So I was wondering actually if this was impacting. But generally speaking, what I felt when I was talking to people, to civil society, if we can call that civil society organizations in Turkmenistan, is that they were much more open and willing to have cooperation from the United States and from Western funders. And the West, again, had a much, in a way, a better image than in Kazakhstan or in Kyrgyzstan. I don't know if you can say about that.
Well, what I would say about that is that it's a generational divide. If you look at Turkmenistan, people over the age of 45 tend to be Russophone. People under the age of 45 tend to be Turkophone because of the prevalence of satellite TV. So basically everybody under the age of 45 in Turkmenistan at this point at least has a passive knowledge of Turkish from watching Turkish soap operas and children's shows. And that is probably, I think, a major factor on that we tend to gloss over.
Please, Kat.
I just want to add a footnote, which is I've been to many conferences of various kinds relating to the former Soviet Union. Often Turkmenistan is not even mentioned. And I'm thrilled to see that this conference is a notable exception by people who know a lot, have done a lot in that, dare I say, often benighted country, which of course has a wonderful culture of its own too, but I'll leave that to others.
So without waving hands or people throwing things at me, I'd like to actually ask the panel to comment. You've all highlighted the importance of continued and deepening engagement in the civil society sector, but at the same time, everyone has tipped their hats to declining funds that are available. Certainly the budget requests that the United States has put forward have been lowered and lowered and lowered, and which forces limits on the kinds of number of projects that can be done, because cost effectiveness, fewer widgets to manage means that it's actually more cost effective for the donor, but then that limits what you actually can do when you're on the ground. We see civil society organizations forced to compete against each other for this ever shrinking pot of funds, which then causes angst in the civil society community. It's sort of one of these chicken and egg scenarios, which we always have in civil society. Which comes first, and how do you, what do you do moving forward? Or I guess, as that great thinker Illich asked us, "Что делать?" But where do we go from here at this point? We have a need, and I would even argue at this point, if you look at Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, who passed a number of constitutional reforms, which actually not focused on very much, but actually had a number of civil society provisions in them, which theoretically could enfranchise civil society, but I don't see the rule of law assistance funds to help implement those kinds of things moving forward. And so it's sort of a lot of lost opportunities here. And I guess the question is, what do we do as a result? And I asked that of all four panelists to briefly respond to, as I know we only have 7 minutes left.
All right, so very briefly, you're not going to change a society in the short term. You have to think long-term. And to think long-term, you have to think of the younger generations and how to expose them to new ideas, and you do that through education, which is why I threw up those statistics. If anybody wants to email me, I'll send you those numbers. I pulled them off the internet, so they must be true. But that, to me, is the crux of the issue, the younger generation, and educate them, show them what the outside world can look like.
Thank you, Alan. Maybe we'll go to the screen. Zuhra, maybe I can turn to you.
Yes, I think there is two things we have to mention. The civil societies which grew from 90s and beginning of 2000, etc., are getting old. This generation who was very euphorical about building democracies and they were pure pro-human rights and etc., etc. This generation was actually committing to these values very much and truly believe and still commit to these issues. So with the funding lost or funding decreasing, these particular NGOs are going to be lost as well. The new generation of NGOs will appear, definitely. But this would be not necessarily the ones who will carry on the values US have been investing in for such a long time. This would be a very different generation. It's a generational issue, of course. It's a new generation. This generation of people who are engaged on faceless communication on, online media and etc., etc. And of course, their language, the communication and language would be different. As rightly was mentioned, either it would be, local language or only maybe English. So this case would be limiting also engagement with civil society increasingly, because the opportunity would be only benefited by people who can actually access it by knowing the language, etc. And also the other concern is what is to be done. Any programs which are funded by US government in our Central Asian countries, inclusive of Tajikistan, demands the accountability, on behalf of the donor and on behalf of the, the society. All this investment, no matter what subject it is it military to military, is it anti-terrorism, is it extremism, anti-narcotics, is it stability, economic prosperity, all of this demands accountability. Who is going to do that accountability demand? It should be civil society. Strong civil society demand will create a culture of demand for accountability in the society. If this is missing, then how we're going to talk about good governance and investment, which would be effective. Also, are we going to talk about investment on resiliency of population by actually increasingly investing in security and anti-narcotics and counterterrorism, while the society will be disengaged? It would be only professionals working on this issue, and the entire society will be disengaged, because the medium of the society, broader society, civil society organizations, whatever, either it's NGOs or indigenous groups and etc., would be disengaged at all in all these serious matters. So that is something should be also considered, as it would be media or NGOs and etc. to will be raising the issues regarding the accountability, which is coming to the point whether all these programs have been effective and how much they are investing in the future generation. And of course, what is the moving forward? What we are building now? What is our future like? What is our collaboration to be like in the next 10 years? Are we sure about this? We don't know. We are now very excited about, business development and etc. Digital divide is growing. Digital development is actually bringing a very new phenomenon now in our engagement. Are we ready for that? So there's much more questions to be asked, and I think it's a time to really be honest ourselves about our capacities, our commitments, and what it is our expectation, and what the countries are expecting from US. Do we actually have a dialogue, or it's actually monologue on both sides? Thank you.
Thank you, Zuhra. Aida, if I can give you maybe a minute and a half.
Okay. In my opinion, when there would be an implementation of a project on the rule of law, for example, it should be about the rule of law. It should mean that this should be implied not only towards the foreign investors, for example, creating a good environment for doing business in Kazakhstan or elsewhere, but also about creating general good atmosphere and legal environment for everyone. Strengthening the independence of judiciary. Can you remember how much money have been invested already only in Kazakhstan to this field, and where we are now? Now we have a parallel reality, having the International Financial Center in Astana, who is actually guaranteeing the rule of law for the foreign investors. And the last thing I wanted to mention, two things basically about the generation. I think knowledge sharing and capacity building is crucial, and it's like evergreen story. It needs to be done constantly, and in the recent years, I haven't seen any substantial projects that being implemented in this area. And like new threats and new topics like human rights in digital era should be on the table as well, not only concentrating around digital economy, but also looking at from different angles to this story. Thank you so much.
Wow, very good. I turn to the master at the end.
The master, but I'm going to be very quick. So, I mean, I will in a way echo what Allan was saying, is that we cannot change, the society of a country in just a few big projects. So my point is probably not to invest so much in big projects, which, by the way, is very regularly criticized, for not having a big impact beyond, organizing kind of big conferences in the end of the event, which without having, again, a real impact. But to echo what Allan was saying, one of the main points is education and training. And when I'm talking about training, is training the civil society organizations, the civil society activists who unfortunately does not have the education, who lacks the training to think about new ideas, to write proposals, to conduct proposals. I was talking with one of my interviews, was saying to me, who is part of a funder, was telling me that the problem is that many CSOs activists are still carrying the suitcases they were carrying in the 90s. And so at a time when we can conduct online training, there are so many ways to help them, to train them. I think that would be a main point, and especially not to focus only on the big CSOs with which we are used to cooperate with, but again to diversify the CSOs we train.
Well, under-promised and over-delivered, this panel certainly was an eye-opener and I think intellectually outstanding. So I ask everyone to thank our panelists, those overseas and those here. And thank all of you for making it, and our folks online for sticking it out. And Zuhra and Aida, please turn off your cameras and go to bed. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.